As I stand here and I look around, I can't help wondering what Derek would say. First of all, he would expect me to say, welcome to you all, and a huge thank you for coming today. And then I think he would say into my ear, why is everyone making this fuss? I don't warrant all of this. But of course, you and I know different. In his last interview that was filmed to celebrate the 10th anniversary of GSAL, Derek can be heard saying, I wasn't an ambitious man. I simply wanted to be an ordinary teacher. Well, true, Derek never led a school. He didn't join the senior leadership team. But I think you and I are here today because we all know Derek Fry was far from an ordinary teacher. He was an extraordinary and inspirational man, and that's why we're here today. And it's lovely because I think there's no more fitting a way to start this memorial to Derek than by hearing read to us the first page of the book that inspired an 8-year-old Derek to do what he did and reach for the stars and astronomical heights. And to read that today, I invite a student that he inspired, Katie Lou White, who left GSAL last year. Katie Lou.
So this is from The Spangled Heavens by Lawrence Edwards. As we look round at our world, at the hills and the flowers and the trees, we feel that we are living in a very lovely and interesting place. But there is also something else which is very beautiful and very interesting, and that is the sky, where we can see the sun and the moon and the stars. The study of these things is called astronomy, and the people who devote their time to it are known as astronomers. Astronomers have been able to discover lots of interesting things about the heavens, and in this book we shall try to realize the meaning of their marvelous discoveries. But before we go any further, we must find out exactly where we are ourselves. As we cannot fly to the stars in order to find out more about them, the only thing we can do is to look very carefully at them from the earth. So let us first find out something about this earth on which we stand.
Thank you, Katie. Now we welcome Mr. Stanley Farrar, Derek's long-time friend, with some early memories.
Does this work?
That one does.
Oh, that one
yeah,
does,
you're
right.
Fine. Go for it.
Good afternoon. We've all got something in common. We all knew Derek, either as a friend or as being taught by him. I'm just going to say a few words about Derek's early life, and I shall just get my crib card out ready for that occasion. Derek was born in London in 1940. His birthday is actually the 19th of May. He was taken from London up to Leeds by his parents because of the conditions in London, and he was taken to a small terrace house near Bellevue Road in Leeds. He was quite young, so he didn't have any opportunity to develop any of the fancy southern ways that we all know about. They brought him up into Leeds to breathe the pure, clear air of Yorkshire and turn him into a true Yorkshireman, which is what he did. He went to school, of course, primary school, and he hit the brick wall at 11. The happy few went to grammar school, and the lower orders and the dim but nice went to the secondary moderns. when we went to the secondary moderns, we were pleasantly surprised because we were taught by good teachers who taught us as much as they could, and so we ended up coming out of secondary school with a reasonable amount of knowledge. Of course, the grammar schoolers came out with lots of lovely tickets to give them a wonderful career. They could go down the golden road to their futures. The leavers from the secondary moderns also got a ticket, but it said Leeds City Transport on it. And it took us down to the Labour Exchange. Derek got a job at Crabtree's printing machine manufacturers. And he stayed there for 2 or 3 years. And then he got more ambitious and moved on to Leeds Fire Clay Company, who were well-known purveyors of toilets, mortuary slabs, tiles, refractory tiles for furnaces, and they were quite a famous company, but now, of course, no more. When he left school, of course, he realised that he had no qualifications. And so what he did was what we all did. We went to evening classes 3 nights a week, 6 till 9 o'clock. That's if you could stay the course. After a hard day's work, we're usually all dropping off by about 8 o'clock. And, of course, if the lecturer asked you a question, you'd get nudged to make the answer, which quite often you couldn't. But still, we all learned as much as we could at night school, and Derek got himself some O-levels, and later on he got himself some A-levels. Of course, we all know Derek had a hobby. I wonder what that was. I think it was astronomy. Yes, that was it. And he joined the Junior Astronomical Society. Now, this was founded in 1953 by Patrick Moore. And so he joined them, and they had lectures, but they also had a practical project, which was to renovate a water tower in Harlow Car in Harrogate. So they went there every weekend and worked upon it. He did think that Patrick Moore might like to actually come and have a look at it and also give them a little talk. And this is what he did. He came up, he stayed with Derek, he looked at the tower and gave this talk. And, of course, that basically was the friendship that developed between him and Patrick Moore. Of course, Derek did lots of observational astronomy himself. I mean, he did say that quite often he was walking down the road looking up at the stars and he collided with the lamppost. But he said he didn't injure himself. He borrowed the telescope from the Junior Astronomical Society and went to some people and asked them if he could use their garden. These people, Jean and Geoffrey Bell, allowed him to, and he got into the garden and observed the sights, the constellations, the stars and all that stuff up there, and he was quite happy. Unfortunately, as all the astronomers know, the lighting, the street lights round were sort of a bit bright. But in those days, of course, it wasn't electric lighting, it was gas. In fact, all the streets looked a bit like an Atkinson Grimshaw portrait. So this light that he was opposite the garden, he decided that it was a bit too bright. So every time he went to look at the stars, he hopped over the garden wall and shinned up the lamp and dyed it out. So he did this for quite some time until, one night he went up and he dyed out his lamp and he slid down it, and standing at the bottom there was the local beat policeman. He said, what are you doing? And Derek said, well, I'm just dyeing it out so I can see the stars better. But I think the policeman thought it was a bit of a tearaway. But, Derek always had his jacket on and his tie on, and he sort of decided that perhaps he was genuine. He took the policeman into the garden, showed him the constellations, the stars, and talked his way out of it. And after that, the policeman did actually come into the garden and watch through his telescope the stars again. I did say to Derek at one occasion, do you ever take your tie off? I said, what do you do when you get a bath? He says, I put it in a plastic bag. So that was Derek, never without a tie. Even on holiday, I used to say to him, oh, for goodness sake, you're on holiday, take your tie off. But no, he didn't. So, onwards. I lost my place. Hang on. It'll be there in a minute. Oh, yes, that's right. So he proceeded onwards to go towards his aim of being a teacher. Jean and Geoffrey Bell were actually teachers, and they encouraged him enormously to become a teacher. So he got his requisite O-levels and A-levels, and he applied to James Graham College, which was in New Farnley. It was a college for people who had been in work, and for more mature people, and he went in there. At 24 years old, actually, he was the youngest in the college. So you can tell there were some quite older people there. But they all became very good teachers. After 3 years, he got his certificate. He'd passed all his exams, and he'd done extremely well. In fact, they wanted him to take a Bachelor of Education degree, which had just started there. But unfortunately, he said he was skint. So he decided to go into teaching. And his first school was a primary school, Green Hill School in Bramley. He spent nearly 2 years there, teaching 42 children in a wooden hut over the playground, freezing in winter, boiling hot in summer, and generally, a bit unpleasant. But Derek carried on, he taught them, he learned his craft in primary school. Towards the end of his sojourn there, he was beginning to become a little bit disillusioned. He did think that he could do a bit better. During his time there, though, he did start on an open university degree. So he had even more aspirations. But I think the general tenor and tone of primary school was getting to him. The typical things, I suppose, conversations he had with kids was that, shall I underline my title, sir? Is this a clean page? Shall I use a clean page, sir? Or, Jason's just broke my pencil, sir. What can I do about it? Oh, dear. It was the pettiness was getting to him, I think. So he looked for a job. He had several interviews, but the one that he was accepted by was Mirfield Grammar School. I think the Open University degree course swung it for him, so he got in there. And he had about 19 years there. But towards the end of his journey there, his teaching there, he was getting a bit tired, because to get to Mirfield, you had to have 2 buses and a train, which frequently didn't turn up, so he would arrive late. You could get there directly from Leeds to Mirfield, but when you got on the bus, by the time you arrived in Mirfield, you were ready to collect your pension. It had taken so long. So onwards, he then applied to Leeds Grammar School for a job. And he actually got it. He was very uncertain at first about his ability to teach in Leeds Grammar School, but Derek always rose to the occasion and taught very well. He continued in Leeds Grammar School until he retired. Again, he was getting a little bit overworked, and he thought that in fact it might be a good point to retire, which he did. But of course he didn't, did he? He just carried on. I mean, he just came up and did the astronomy. I mean, this was it. And they got him for note, didn't they? He didn't want any money because he was doing the thing that he loved. He loved teaching. This was Derek all over. And so he did it for note. So, well, he didn't worry about that. Not at all. So Derek then carried on, unfortunately, until he died. But I think he died knowing that, in fact, he wasn't going to decline. The last thing he actually wanted was to have to stop teaching at Leeds Grammar School and just go home and not do anything else again. That would have been a very great disappointment to him. So even though it is sad, I think Derek would have wished it this way. I was a friend of Derek's for 57 years. We went along together, we went to night school together, and he actually persuaded me to go into teaching, which was a mammoth job. But anyway, Derek could persuade anybody to do anything, couldn't he, really? So I followed him down the track and went into teaching myself. So Derek was really the best friend that anybody could ever have. And I will be eternally grateful to him for being such a friend. Thank you.
Well done. I'm sure Derek's so proud of you, Stanley. Thank you. To hear about some of the memories of those 19 years at Mirfield, we're very grateful that Dr. Heather Allinson has come along to talk to us today. Thank you.
I've had to write mine down, I'm afraid. It's an honour and a privilege to speak here today, and I thank the host for inviting me and offer a personal view of Derek's time in Mirfield. I've known Derek all my life, and I think the extraordinary can then seem a little less so, but I hope I can bring it to life here. Since I was invited here to speak, I've been transported back to being a teenager in the 1980s. I feel the need to sit up straight, as we are often implored to do, and to speak in well-crafted sentences. I have been over this talk several times to look for grammatical errors. I'm sure there are many. So my story starts in 1969. It's appropriately the year of the moon landings. I was 2 months old, and the fourth child of Heather Allinson. He started a new job as the head of physics at Mirfield Grammar School. And there, of course, he met Derek, a veteran of 2 years at the school, and a strong and enduring friendship was to be formed. Maybe because both men were independently minded, with the same dry wit, or maybe because both had fought hard to be well educated after their working lives had begun and believed in the power of education to change lives. Whatever the catalyst, they formed a teaching partnership of 18 years. And I have an image of them both standing shoulder to shoulder now, watching over today's proceedings with wry smiles, exchanging a few pithy comments on the day's events. In 1972, the school became Mirfield High School and moved to the site of the former secondary modern. Most of the science staff, including Derek, were housed in the Rosler block, as it was called, and that was somewhat separate from the main school buildings. It was home to a friendly and dedicated staff, most staying there a very long time, and Derek, as we've heard, has stayed in Mirfield for a total of around 20 years. To this day, staff from then are still in touch, including Jeff Jones, who is here today, and the lab technicians, Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Smith. I'm told that Hobnob Corner was established to provide light relief during breaks. It was also a successful department, and it sent maybe 2 or 3 A-level students per year to Oxford and Cambridge throughout the 70s and 80s, and that's at a time before Ofsted and government inclusion targets. As we heard, Derek had a long commute to work. I think many people in Mirfield will have seen him walking briskly from the train station, old brown leather briefcase in hand. Looking back, Derek said to me years later that he never would have survived a winter in Mirfield without a slow cooker to come home to a hot meal. Ever practical and self-sufficient. No ready meals for him. Nevertheless, Derek put his commute to use. He used one train journey for a lesson on velocity. He measured the time it took to go through Morley Tunnel, and in class, we calculated the average speed of the train, being given the length of the tunnel. He also learnt Russian whilst commuting in preparation for a visit to that country. Despite his long journey, I don't remember Derek being off school due to illness or travel mishaps. His lessons were memorable. I'm sure you've all got your own memories. He announced at the start of one of our lessons that we're going to measure the size of a molecule with a rule, I should say, a tub of hot water and a drop of oil. My sister remembers Derek swinging a bucket of water around his head to demonstrate centrifugal force and jumping off a moving trolley to show momentum. Conservation of energy was shown by sprinting up and down the Russell Block stairs. And every former pupil I have spoken to remembers Derek's most special performance. He would traverse a gym on his hands. Apparently only retired when he was 70 from doing this. Derek is also well known for his sayings. They include, "Beware of hubris." The sixth form common room was labelled the den of iniquity. I was christened one of the 3 Stooges, along with 2 girlfriends, the top girls in that year. Of course, Derek's long ticks were legendary. We used to measure the length of them. We used to see who had the longest. Other things, of course, we fondly remember are his grey lab coat, his slide rule, and his dog and companion, Charlie. There was an element of mischief and fun in Derek. We all know that he was very keen on astronomy, but once he joined the Flat Earth Society, just to keep an eye on them. He did this under the pseudonym of Quintin Cumber, so the organisation would write to him as Mr. Cucumber. Another anecdote springs to mind. Derek met the former West End star Peggy Ashcroft on Leeds Station. They got chatting on the platform, and she asked if he was going to London. Well, he was now. Despite actually planning only to go home on the local train. He then spent a happy journey all the way to London, chatting to his idol, and then returning home on the next train. I've received 2 testimonies from former high school pupils in the last week, and I really wanted to include these because they really illustrate Derek's generosity of spirit and time and his belief in education, I think they also show his human side and how he inspired people. The first one is from an optician who now lives in Auckland. Being taught by Derek completely changed my life. I was in the lowest stream for physics, and he beckoned me out to the line outside the first physics lesson in Form 4, which is, I think, Year 10, and put me in his class. At that stage, I was in set 3 or 4 for everything, apart from woodwork, and was doing weekly remedial English. Anyway, he taught in such an inspiring way, it was impossible not to learn in his lessons. He'd make sure the class kept up, he'd ask questions, and if you got the answer right, he might ask, "Are you sure?" So you and all the others who thought you'd given the right answer would pay attention anyway. There was a sixth former in our fifth form class who was trying to get O-level physics to join the Navy. Mr. Fry made him totally comfortable about it. He treated everyone in the class with immense respect. Every now and then, I used to get a phone call from a young man who had been taught by Mr. Fry. Mr. Fry had given him my number and that he should look me up when visiting Auckland. It was after one of these encounters I realised what a profound effect he'd had on me. There was a kid just like me. He'd tell me how Derek had patiently helped him, how one of his friends who needed a physics A-level for medicine had been tutored at home by Derek. I think Derek enjoyed teaching the bright kids, the exceptional physics kids, but the thing he really enjoyed was helping kids who perhaps weren't natural physicists to achieving a pass in physics that they required as part of their education. Another one from a friend of mine. Mr. Fry was incomparable as a form teacher in the sixth form. Everyone wanted to be in his form. I was so lucky. He was so compassionate when I had to attend 2 family funerals in a short space of time. My physics report from my O-level mocks in 1985, which were dire, likened me to Boxer in Animal Farm. Loyal, hard-working, dedicated, but dim-witted. He was so astute. This didn't help me with physics, but did inspire me to read Animal Farm and many, many other books. I think Derek claimed to be reading 3+ books a week at that time, and I was amazed at that. And now in a good week, I can match him. I'm not sure what precipitated the end of Derek's time in Mirfield. Was it a long commute, or my father thinking about early retirement? Whatever it was, fortunately for Derek, a vacancy arose much closer to home at Leeds Grammar School, then housed at Woodhouse Moor. Ever the serious, principled man, I remember discussions on whether he should move into the private sector. However, the rest, as they say, is history, and Derek obviously made the right choice. A very loyal friend, Derek continued to meet my parents for meals after my dad retired in 1990, and in the years after my father passed away, Derek was a very good friend to my mum. He attended my wedding and my sister's, and if you've ever wanted to know what your former physics teacher gives us a wedding present, well, it's a mass balance, of course, or a kitchen scales. Meeting Derek again after a few years' break, I asked how he was, and he replied that he was living life modestly, which I could well imagine. Although I haven't seen Derek in person in recent years, the photographs I see of him, he hasn't changed at all since the 1980s. Not only was he the same in appearance, he was ever humble, constant in his views and manner throughout his life. So I'm left with the memory of a man who loved life and loved learning, a principled man and a gentleman. Derek taught me that learning in all its forms is to be treasured, and independence of thought is invaluable. There is no need to conform, nevertheless, you can do it courteously. Thank you.
Derek left me his instructions as to which hymns were to be sung today. And we're going to sing the first one, which is Dear Lord and Father of Mankind. The first verse will be sung as a solo, But could I ask you all to stand and then join in the second and the remaining verses? Thank you. Very movingly, Derek left us his own words to be read to us. And first of all, we shall hear a message from Derek to his colleagues, read by his close friend and colleague, Mr. Andrew Bridgewater, and then Derek's message to his students, read by the colleague with whom he shared his current astronomy set, Dr. Michelle de Valle.
Derek's message to former and present colleagues. Thank you for being here today. I have always been proud to share your common room and benefit from your wit, good humour and erudition. Our children are fortunate to be under your tutelage. I am grateful for the unceasing kindnesses which you have bestowed on me over many years. God bless. And Derek.
To my former and present pupils, I am proud of so many aspects of school. You should know that I have always derived my greatest pride from the quality of the academic work which you did for me in the classroom. Much of it has been quite inspirational. It has been my privilege to share physics and astronomy with you. Thank you for your good humour and patience, especially when on the receiving end of my anecdotes. Strive to have a contented life and to be a force for good in the lives of others, and take good care of our wonderful school. God bless, DF.
I'm sure we are all grateful for Derek's message to us. Thank you. Now, Derek served under many principals, and today Mrs. Sue Woodroofe, the present principal of the Grammar School at Leeds, will share her experiences of Derek with you.
As I'm sure you will appreciate, moments like these are amongst the saddest for a principal. Losing a much-loved and valued member of a school community affects so many people: children, staff, parents, governors, alumni. And yet it's also true that surrounded by that very loving community, we can all help each other to come to terms with our grief as we share many, many happy memories of Derek. Mr. Fry certainly was a most loved and valued member of this community. And so, as you've heard, I've been asked to say a few words about what it was like to be his principal. Well, first of all, as you've heard from Stanley, it was very cheap, because for the last 18 years, Derek worked without any pay at all and refused to accept any, despite many protestations over those years, I understand. His commitment to this place since the year 2000 has been entirely voluntary, which says a lot. So after the official retirement, shall we say, Derek continued to come into school almost daily, and his presence around the place was a source of great joy and comfort to many. You've already heard it, but I can testify with my experience of the last 2 years. In its truest sense, Derek was a born teacher. He put the children first, always. He was erudite. He was interested in everything and interesting to listen to. He valued learning above all, and he never narrowed it to its simplest form, but always saw connections in everything and encouraged his students to reach for the stars metaphorically as well as intellectually. His smile was infectious, his courtesy and kindness to all unending. Tiny story that only a few may know is that we've always have members of staff in hospital for different things at different times. It's an inevitable part of the cycle of life. And a member of staff who's been in and out of hospital several times over the last 3 months, every day she's been in hospital, Derek telephoned the ward to find out how she was and to pass on a message. And he was due to visit her the day after he passed away. Such was his unending kindness and his attention to detail behind the scenes that you didn't always know about up front. Derek, as you've heard, and it was absolutely true, developed deep and respectful relationships with everyone he met. He was a wonderful role model for us all. I first became aware of Derek from my desk in Brussels when a handwritten letter arrived asking for reassurance that astronomy would not be removed from the curriculum once I had arrived in Leeds. Well, I was astonished on 2 counts. Firstly, I was struggling to remember when I'd last received a handwritten letter about an academic matter, and I have to say the lack of email struck me as charming. But secondly, I was really worried what kind of message I must have given in my early visits here if this Mr. Fry had thought for a moment I was the sort of principal who would want to limit opportunities for pupils. So I contacted school immediately to ask for some context and received the reply. Oh, that's Derek. He really is thought of as a legend in these parts. You can ask anyone. So, of course, I teased Derek about this legendary status once I arrived. And I know it can be an overused phrase in teenage parlance these days, but in fact, every student I spoke to in those early days did indeed describe Mr. Fry as a legend. They all said the same thing. Some of them even went so far as to call him a ledge. And I think that's some kind of sort of extra familiar legend, is the way I interpreted it. And Derek laughed a lot when I tried to persuade him that he was a ledge and that actually that was a good thing. We did have one disagreement when I first arrived too. Throughout my 2 years working with Derek, very short I know in comparison to others speaking today, he had a wonderful habit of popping in to see me most weeks, to fill me in on how everyone was, maybe to ask for something, maybe to share some good news, and frequently a snippet from The Guardian. His visitations, of course, were never booked, and he always prefaced his drop-in to my PA with, "Has Mrs. Woodroofe got 5 minutes? I promise I will be quick." Well, there never were only 5 minutes in those meetings, but they were very precious minutes in my working week, when I came to realise what a wonderful man he was and what an inspirational teacher he continued to be, even in retirement. But our disagreement came about when I insisted that he had to stop calling me principal, boss, Mrs. Woodroofe, and call me Sue. And he refused. So we ended up with a little bit of a standoff, which ended with me saying that if we were to be friends and colleagues in the future, then it had to be Sue or I would refuse the 5-minute only drop-in meetings. So he agreed to call me Sue. Derek so evidently loved this school with every fibre of his being. And so it was a real privilege for me on my first speech day in the town hall in November 2016 to award Derek with a very special prize, by far and away the most popular prize of the evening. Because I'd been told that Derek was celebrating 30 years of continuous service, supervising the students on the risers behind the stage. Now, of course, I was unsure as to the expected level of formality required of a new principal, so I was delighted when everyone agreed that presenting a certificate to Mr. Fry on this occasion would be perfectly acceptable. Of course, it was the prize that brought the house down, and Derek drew upon his usual eloquence to address the assembled throng in the middle of the principal's speech. Derek attended so many school events, most often very humbly. Whether it was a house competition or a lecture, a concert, a play, you would turn around in this very assembly hall and he was there. In fact, he was usually over there. And there he was in the midst of the audience, smiling so proudly and kindly as he looked on what the students were achieving and clearly loving every minute of it. In particular, among many things Derek was heard to say, he did indeed say many times that he would not be able to live without music. So when you looked at the programme, you might have been a little bit surprised at the section that will follow after my speech. But actually, it's very poignant to all of us in school now. Because in senior school, on the last day of every term, we end the day with an assembly in the sports hall. And with 1,400 children in a sports hall, it has a powerful effect of celebrating all that students have done. And Derek never missed a final assembly at the end of term. So, at the end of this spring term in March, as always, we had one of our very talented, there are many of them, music ensembles from our students who would play us out at the end of the assembly. It was our standard practice. So, the piece that played us out, this term just gone, in a very orderly fashion, was Chicken by Pee Wee Ellis, performed by the Jazz Ensemble. As all of the pupils exited, row by row, chairs were stacked away almost silently so that the music could be heard. And as the throngs cleared, one person was left sitting in a lone chair, almost in the middle of the hall, as all else had been cleared around him. Derek, and this is my final memory of him, and I am so grateful for it. Derek was leaning back contentedly on his chair, folded arms, legs stretched out, crossed at the ankles, with the biggest smile on his face as he watched this ensemble perform. And when the music finished, his applause could be heard very clearly across the room. But of course this was Derek, so applause wasn't enough. And just as he had special words for so many of us in this room today, he had a special word of thanks for every member of the group who played. So indeed, my final memory of Derek, my final exchange of conversation with him, in the midst of the school that he loved and the school that loved him in return. So therefore, when you listen in the programme to Chicken by Pee Wee Ellis, and you may think it's an odd thing to have at a memorial service, I ask you to remember that actually it's the last music among many that Derek heard played at GSAL, and it's played by the last students that he spoke to at the end of last term. I asked the staff to forgive my Orwellian tautology earlier this term, because we know, do we not, that no one is irreplaceable, but some people are more irreplaceable than others. Derek was indeed a legend. He was simply unique. It was an absolute privilege to work alongside him, even for the short time that I had. And I do not think that I'm the only one here who believes today that my life is the richer for having known him and counted him as my friend, as well as all that he gave to this school, which is also the richer for having known him. There will never be anyone like him. Our motto at GSAL is be inspired. And Derek epitomised that as a way of life each and every day. A teacher, a gentleman. Derek Fry was an inspiration to the last.
Thank you to the jazz ensemble. Derek's real joy, of course, was his students, and I know that they were equally and are equally fond of him. So we're very proud that sharing their memories of Derek are Rowan, Aaron, Sam, Matthew and Stephen, all members of Derek and Michelle's current astronomy set, will speak to you now.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we please have one more round of applause for the jazz ensemble that just played, because they were amazing. Good afternoon. The five of us are here today to share our tribute to one of the most inspirational, kind-hearted and profound individuals we will ever have the honour to meet and share our education with.
My name is Arun, and I first met Mr. Fry when I began the astronomy class in Year 7. After attending the course for just a few months, Mr. Fry's encouragement and support was already overwhelming. Even stating in a letter to my mother, I see a kindred spirit in Arun, and behind me is a moral imperative to encourage him as much as I can, both professionally and personally. Initially, I attended the course for personal interest, but it became apparent that Mr. Fry believed I could complete the course. After finishing the first year, Mr. Fry sent a letter to me which contained the following quote: "Perhaps you have not realized the fact that I have huge admiration for your determination and commitment. I really am delighted that you have survived the first year." Letters such as these written by Mr. Fry to his students epitomise his benevolence, patience and belief which he had for all his students. I did survive the course thanks to solely his support, and at age 12 I did pass the GCSE. When I received my certificate, I had to leave it in his possession, as he insisted on purchasing me a frame so he could present it back to me, further demonstrating his true kindness.
My name is Stephen, and I started astronomy in Year 11. But after about half a year, I decided to give it up. I did this because I wasn't doing as well as I wanted to in English, so as you can imagine, I felt like I'd disappointed him a bit. I was really worried to tell Mr. Fry I was giving astronomy up, and that I wouldn't talk to him as often, because I'd only gotten to know him through astronomy. Luckily, and as those who knew Mr. Fry would expect, he continued to show great interest in my academics and my life in general. He would always ask me about grammar and how English was going. Then on results day, he was asking me how I did and congratulating me. He then went on to write me a letter, and I quote, "without wishing to be overly formal."
My name is Matthew, and myself, Sam and Rohan have had the absolute privilege over the past 2 years of being Mr. Fry's students in astronomy. On his offering, we went on to join Mr. Fry in weekly Just for Fun sessions, JF Squared as he called it, where we would further explore what truly interested us, even if this meant embarking upon tangents far beyond the so-called syllabus. Not that this was unusual for Mr. Fry.
This afternoon we hope to share with you the image of the mischievous but deeply caring gentleman we all knew and loved.
As most of you will know, Mr. Fry had a passion for good old-fashioned tradition, and he was not afraid to show it. In fact, in one of our very first astronomy lessons, in order to perform a calculation, Mr. Fry asked us to pull out our RTCs, and an atmosphere of confusion swept the room, before he then explained himself, RTCs being rinky-tinky calculators. And in fact, the only RTC that Mr. Fry ever owned was one that was stored in a glass case that read, "For viewing purposes only," gifted to him by some of his former astronomy students. Now, this led him to also introduce us to his magic sticks, or as some of the older generation in the room might know them, slide rules. And every calculation Mr. Fry performed was done on the Rolls Royce of his slide rules.
It wasn't just the RTC he rejected, but rather technology in general. I'll let him explain in his own words. I tried to telephone 6 of the children. On every occasion, I was invited to leave a message on an answering machine. I've elevated myself to the level of high principle not to communicate with electronic devices. The above quote is from a letter that Mr. Fry wrote. As most of us know, this was Mr. Fry's primary method of communication. However, his letters were rarely a short message, but rather a beautifully crafted piece of literature. This thoughtfulness carries so much more weight than the modern-day text message. And with Mr. Fry encouraging us to write letters, I was enlightened by the experience, having far more time to compose my thoughts and portray greater meaning. I will deeply miss the excitement of coming home to see a white envelope on the floor with my name scribed in his signature black fountain pen.
Nor was anyone quite as much a stickler as Mr. Fry. Our grammar quite possibly improved more in astronomy than it did in our English lessons. So I ask you all to bear in mind that the moon, the sun, the earth should all be spelt with capital letters, not lowercase, and that further is for figurative distance, while farther for physical ones.
Now, Mr. Fry's thorough nature even extended as far as his recipe for porridge, which he so kindly shared with us. And only upon reading it did we realise that step 4 of 12 indicated that we would need to start the night before.
So whether it be his distaste for Elvis and the Beatles, being unable to understand the need for such hip gyration, his rejection of quantum physics, his declaration that social media would not catch on, or his only vexation being bus passengers who did not have their money ready, Mr. Fry really was a man of tradition. Mr. Fry conducted himself with an unparalleled level of respect towards everyone, always assuming the best of anyone, no matter their so-called reputation. He always displayed such courtesy to everyone, addressing all his students and new people he met by their surname, including us.
However, truth be told, as our relationship with Mr. Fry developed over time, it wouldn't be unheard of for him to fall into using our first names, not that he was very comfortable with that.
Mr. Fry treated us all as individuals, and he took the time to get to know everyone in turn. When you were talking to him, you could tell that he was intently listening, and he would remember everything that was said. His respect in conversation was evident, as he rarely talked about himself. He had a genuine interest in the lives of his students. Perhaps Mr. Fry's only disciplinary technique was the astronomical guilt that would consume you should you feel that you'd let him down.
Another point to mention is Mr. Fry's generosity and selflessness. For example, he provided all his current astronomy students with a slide rule each, sharing his love for the tradition, which resulted in me writing a letter to the lovely Mrs. Barnes, who I had never met, to thank her for providing the slide rules. And Mr. Fry suggested that 3 sides of A4 should be enough.
Whether it be him buying us numerous books, such as one called Nothing, which he humorously commented would make us the smartest Alex in the land, when someone would ask, "What are you reading?" and we would reply, "Nothing." Or the giving Matthew one of his 3 grey lab coats, or even Dr. Diwali her favourite biscuits on numerous occasions, or even myself, he once gave me his favourite box set of DVDs. Mr. Fry was inconceivably generous, and he would regularly take his astronomers for a Christmas dinner, which became a yearly tradition.
He was also an immensely talented teacher, a great intellectual mind, able to lead a lesson along any tangent he desired whilst keeping the education of his students paramount. He would only, as has already been mentioned, visit a country if he could speak their language, which led him both to learn Russian and Spanish. Once, when we asked him what he'd been doing that morning, he'd replied that he'd been to Marks and Spencer's, where he'd been calculating the gain in gravitational potential energy as he went up an escalator. His combination of dedication to his job and great intelligence has allowed him to compile a collection of physics and astronomy notes, the standard of which is unparalleled.
This commitment meant he spent over 20 hours on each astronomy paper writing suggested answers. This is a unique level of commitment and ability.
The mischievous side of Mr. Fry was one that we didn't all see in the corridor. However, it was a defining part of his character. Every one of our so-called A-level astronomy lessons, he would give myself, Sam and Rohan a sugary treat. This ranged from Sainsbury's chocolate cookies to a loaf of Stollen each, always well above our recommended sugar intake. And, if you haven't realised this yet, this meant that Mr. Fry was breaking the school rules by allowing us to eat in the physics laboratories. However, if any teacher were to walk in and witness the crime firsthand, Mr. Fry would bribe them with a cookie, and of course they dare not refuse, so they too would be incriminated.
Whether it be accidentally squirting water from a syringe at his students, or his secret love for the in-betweeners, or his declaration that physics is the only science and that anything else is merely stamp collecting, Mr. Fry really was a man of mischief.
We hope that in these few moments we've been able to share with you some of our fond memories of Mr. Fry. He was a man of universal influence whose wisdom and presence will forever emanate throughout our lives and the lives of multiple generations who had the pleasure of knowing him. It is important to remember that as the rawness of losing Mr. Fry slowly wanes, we'll all be left with a profound inspiration from such a generous, caring, and extraordinary man, an inspiration which we will forever be grateful to have.
Finally, we will leave you with this. Only recently, Mr. Fry was teaching us a lesson on angular momentum, and when he turned enthusiastically from the complex calculation that he was writing on the board, he turned to us and he said, "Gentlemen, you must not tell anybody this, but I'm on a roll."
So with that, we hope that wherever you are now, Mr. Fry, you'll be as you always were, on a roll. Thank you.
And so from our present GSAL students, we welcome back Dr. Sam Cohen, a former Leeds Grammar School student.
Some days stay with you for a lifetime. 20 years ago, as a schoolboy, I boarded a train from Leeds to London. Although it was a dreary Saturday morning, at the time, it was one of the most exciting days of my life. Now, going to London was a rare event in itself, but this trip was unique because I was being taken shopping for something very special. I still remember the bell ringing as we entered the shop, the fascination as we examined and dismissed the first two instruments offered, before a nod of satisfaction after a detailed look at the third. That was the day that Mr. Fry took me to London to buy my first telescope. It was an extraordinary experience for me to be taken on such an adventure, but it was exactly the sort of thing that Mr. Fry did without a second thought. The excitement of that day out and the many physics and astronomy classes with Mr. Fry in many ways set the course of my life. Although I come from a family with no background in science whatsoever, Mr. Fry inspired and nurtured my early interest in science, which to him was so often just for fun, or JF squared, as he called it. And I was delighted to hear from some of his current students that that phrase had continued to the present day. His enthusiasm was infectious, and without it, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you today. Few people genuinely have a lasting impact on your life. What's striking is that not only for me, but for so many of us here today, Mr. Fry was one of those rare people. And he taught us so much more than science. Mr. Fry taught us to reach for the stars and gave us all the confidence to believe that we could achieve anything. No matter what your ambitions, there was nothing he wouldn't do to support one of his students. And he was also the definition of a perfect gentleman. Mr. Fry always set an incredible example, teaching us to treat each other with respect and kindness. 20 years on, after our trip to London, just a few months ago in fact, I was honoured to give the Mark Bailey Lecture in this hall and to dedicate that talk to Mr. Fry. Soon afterwards, Mr. Fry came to visit me and my wife in Cambridge, where I'd ended up in large part because of him. We walked through the same courts that Sir Isaac Newton had once occupied and deliberated on the eminent scientists whose statues surrounded us. And over dinner that evening, he was as interested in talking to the waiting staff as he was to the distinguished scientist sitting across from him. Everyone he met was important to him, and to everyone who met him, Mr. Fry was truly one of a kind. Even now, months later, people around college still warmly recall the time that my school teacher came to visit. I know I speak for so many of you here today when I say that I'm incredibly grateful and honoured to have had Mr. Fry as a teacher, a mentor, and as a friend. And so on behalf of all his students here at this school, I would like to say thank you. Mr. Fry, we'll miss you.
I know that one of the things that made Derek very proud was being immortalised by his friend and former colleague, the author Joanne Harris, who will share her memories with us now. Thank you.
It's so nice to see so many people coming out to celebrate the life and the inspiration that was Derek Fry. And I feel very honoured to have been a colleague of his and a friend of his for such a long time. I arrived at the old Leeds Grammar School in the mid-late 80s. I'd just come from a comprehensive school in Dewsbury. Before that, I'd come from a comprehensive school in Barnsley. I had no idea what Leeds Grammar School was going to be like. It was like teaching in Gormenghast. And Mr. Fry befriended me from the start and told me how to go on, because I was a kind of prickly 26-year-old. I didn't really know how to behave. I was surrounded by mostly old men and teenage boys. I made pretty much every mistake I could possibly make. I rubbed up the wrong way many venerable colleagues, completely failed to control various noisy classes of boys. And Mr. Fry, who insisted on calling me Mrs. Harris for about 10 years before he finally accepted to call me Joanne, took me under his wing and gave me a number of pieces of advice which still stand today. One of the things he said to me at the beginning when he saw me trying to control large groups of whooping, shouting boys, he said, "You know, Mrs. Harris, I don't generally feel that shouting at boys is the right way to do it." And I said, "Well, Mr. Jolly does it all the time." And he said, yes, but Mr. Jolly is physically imposing and has a set of lungs that you, Mrs. Harris, won't be able to ever quite hope for. I personally find, he said, that it helps enormously if you treat boys like gentlemen, and they will then behave like gentlemen. And he said this with a measure of kind reproach, which was as close as he ever got to telling me off. He never shouted. He was a gentleman of modest height and not particularly great lung capacity, and his way of showing disapproval was a small sigh and sometimes a bow of the head, and that seemed to work. That seemed to work, and I took a leaf out of his book and found that it worked for me too. A few things that you may not know about Mr. Fry that I gathered in our many long conversations in the staff room and then later when we both retired and went our different ways. He was extremely good at making cakes. He was rather fond of cakes and biscuits and very good at making them, also making raspberry jam, which he would occasionally bring into the staff room and distribute to the people he liked best. I had several jars of them, and I remember writing an ode to one of them in the style of Keats, which I shall not recite here. He was very interested in science fiction, as you would expect for somebody who'd spent his whole life looking at the stars. And in fact, this may not be generally known, but he divulged to me at one point, after I had divulged to him that I'd written a book, that he too had written a book when he was in his 20s, which sadly had never seen publication, which was called Raiders from Galaxy 51. And if anybody has a copy of this book, I would be very, very keen to read it, because he never, ever allowed me to see the manuscript, which I'm still very regretful of. Now, while I was teaching at LGS, I was also writing books for my own pleasure. This was my hobby, as Derek's was looking at the stars, and I never thought that it would get anywhere. 2 of them had been published to what we will call a cult audience, which means that they were largely unread. And the 3rd one I wrote while I was teaching at LGS, and as many would-be writers do, I took my inspiration from the people around me, because I wasn't able to go off looking for people to write about. I looked at some of my colleagues, pupils, and friends, and managed to insert them into this book, which I was sure would never see the light of day. It did see the light of day, and Mr. Fry was one of the people I inserted in the book, with his dog, and I wrote him as a French gentleman, so I thought that nobody would recognize him. When the book came out, and was really quite surprisingly successful, considered that I hadn't really thought that it would be, I realized that I ought to really have changed the name of the dog if I had wanted Mr. Fry. If I had wanted Mr. Fry to maintain complete anonymity. Followed a period of some unease while boys from LGS would come to me going, "Mrs. Harris, is it true that Mr. Fry's in your book?" And then when there was a movie of the book, who's going to play Mr. Fry? Who's going to play Charlie? Finally, when the longed-for movie came out, and Mr. Fry by then was feeling quite anxious, because he was a very modest individual and felt that he didn't really deserve to be immortalised in a book, and he also was quite worried about what I might have said about him, and what I might have exaggerated, and his idea of the movies, and he loved the movies, but he didn't feel that he belonged in a movie, and so I promised that I would take him to the one movie in Headingley that would allow us to take his dog, and we sat through all 3 hours of the movie. And I was very worried about what he would think. I was very concerned that he wouldn't feel that I'd taken a liberty borrowing aspects of his personality and his mannerisms and his speech patterns and making them into this other character. And every time his character came on screen, I would hear a kind of squeak from Mr. Fry, this kind of little intake of breath, and the dog would whine, and I thought, oh dear, this is terrible. I'm going to be at the end of a terrible ticking off at the end of this movie. And finally, when it was over, we went out into the sunlight, and I said, well, Mr. Fry, what did you think of that? And he looked at me and said, Mrs. Harris, they've made me so tall. I think he quite enjoyed the attention once he got used to it. And he felt that he didn't quite deserve the admiration that he had from so many people, but of course we know that he did. I left in 2000, the same time that Derek retired, but we stayed in touch, we saw each other often, I phoned often. I felt really that I needed a kind of homeopathic dose of Leeds Grammar School to remind me why I'd left, but I also couldn't bear to leave certain people behind, and I felt that Derek was really one of those people, the principal one of those people that I couldn't quite leave behind, and so we talked a great deal, and I know how much he loved this school, and he loved the people in it, and he was completely devoted to it. He was devoted to his duty as an educator, and I hope, and I'm pretty sure, that he was aware how much love there was for him from ex-pupils, current pupils, ex-colleagues, from you, from me. because he may have been a man of modest stature, but boy, he cast a long shadow. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I ask Peter Jolly and Paul Lunn to share with us their memories of their colleague, Derek.
I had the absolute privilege and honour of working with Derek as a colleague for over 30 years. And in all that time, I heard many people say how kind he'd been to them, and I saw and heard many acts of kindness. And like many of you here today, I have felt the benefit of those kindnesses, both great and small, that he bestowed upon us. The kindnesses were always thoughtful, appropriate, and quietly given. They were not done for effect. They were not done because it would curry favour. Not done because someone was watching. And they were not done because he felt that at some time in the future, the kindness would be repaid to him. He was undoubtedly a kind man. He was kind to animals. Anybody who ever saw him with Patch or Charlie could see that. And he was kind to other people's pets too, with equal care and compassion. He was the man who would travel on public transport, often on a sequence of buses and railways, across the county just to sit quietly with those who were seriously ill or distressed. His letters were legendary. He would spend time writing carefully crafted letters to people and to families that he knew were struggling. His precise choice of words and expressions bringing comfort to all those who read them. His kind smile on a corridor could reassure a troubled child whom he had never taught. His gentle and wise words would placate and soothe the most irate of us. He was unfailingly kind to all those students sitting exams or studying in classes. His ability to reassure people under stress was exemplary. Derek's kindness knew no boundaries. It was given freely, without question or invitation. It was given regardless of background or status or age or situation. He was that kind of a kind man. He knew deeply the value of kindness. And he bestowed it so freely because he knew it would make a difference in the lives of others. However, the word kind can be too easily used, and often in a rather loose way, a little like the word nice. I once used the word nice in the company of Derek. His face spoke volumes of his displeasure of my thoughtlessness in the use of such a word. And as he relaxed his grimace, he proceeded to ask me, in that particular way of his, what do you actually mean by that word nice, Paul? And just perhaps, in Derek's case, kind is just not the word, because it falls well short of those countless acts that Derek did. Those acts given routinely every day and in every way and in every place, and for hosts whosoever that particular kindness would make a difference to. That was all so much more than simply kindness. For me, in all that he did for others, he was manifestly showing us all his great humanity. And that trait of Derek's will, I know, remain with all of us who knew him for the rest of our lives. And he did show us great humanity. And he did so allied to one of his other great strengths. He showed us such great humanity with absolute and utter humility.
I'm sure you will like to hear this, placed in our hands on arrival this afternoon, quite by surprise. And it is written by Catherine Julie Baden, who is the daughter of Derek's neighbour, Rose, who is 93 today and here with us now. Many happy returns, Rose. We had a gentle neighbour. Mr. Fry was his name. He was a grammar school teacher. Maths, physics and astronomy, his game. Well known for his kindness and his gentlemanly air, he would send felicitations with a warm attitude of care. A man of great integrity, upstanding and sincere, facing the world directly with great intellect, no fear. Wearing a badge of decency that many could admire, featured in a Joanne Harris novel, a genuine character to which many aspire. Despite all, he had a simple life. Education and teaching was his all, supporting the leaders of tomorrow, guiding them gently so they did not fall. A humble man with little ego. We will miss his practical sense, yet as we pause to say goodbye, we see his impact was immense. And if there is a lesson, when we think of him, we can recall it is that kindness, caring and integrity will truly conquer all. Catherine, thank you. Fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and recipient of its award for service to astronomy, the value of which he donated to the Lawson Library because it was, of course, to the credit of his students, not himself. Fellow of the Institute of Physics, and as such, the first school teacher to be so recognised. The tributes to Derek are volumes already, and nothing said today can be more eloquent than the pupils' guard of honour yesterday or this attendance now, in this number, with this determination to be here, in this spirit of sadness and yet gratitude. And as we know, he would deflect all that. He would say, "It was very kind of you to come." It was quite a good turnout, wasn't it? Really. Much has been said, so let us rehearse our common ground. Did we ever part company with him feeling in better spirits than when we met? Let's take that for unanimity, shall we? Did you ever have a letter from him? I once replied without taking the trouble to use a fountain pen. His rebuke was by return of post, as was necessarily my contrition. I beg you, do not feel badly because you remained in his epistolary debt. He had none, and you will not be alone. Did he ever make you laugh out loud? Did you end up in a career as a direct result of his inspirational teaching? Did you dedicate your PhD thesis to him? And of how many assemblies in the world can you ask that question about a man and expect double figures? I even dare ask whether anyone wrote a few novels based on his character, but we already know the answer to that. If, as a former pupil, you invited him to your reunion, or your wedding even, let me tell you, he loved that. He was so proud of such an honour, and so he should be. No man more eschewed the social media, and yet no man was more venerated there by expressions of respect, appreciation, admiration, and gratitude. We loved that in the classroom he exercised totally disciplinary control without turning a hair. No pupil was sufficiently mischievous to challenge his quiet, gentle authority. Even those who presumed for a moment that they might be able to shock or amuse were effortlessly contained. For example, at the front of a queue of boys awaiting permission to enter the classroom, "Sir, do you know what my dad's girlfriend said about you?" "Now, young man, let me stop you right there." The only time I ever knew of his having raised his voice was to a gang of thugs on a deserted Leeds city station who had, at a distance, assessed him as an easy target. He unscathed, they fled, presumably even in their simplicity, recognizing stature as something beyond physique. In fact, our compact colossus. Well capable of the slapstick, walking the lab on his hands, or performing a not entirely accurate river dance, he loved the comedy of Kenneth Horne's Round the Horn, Tony Hancock's Half Hour, the risque Max Miller, the Goon Show, Yes Minister, Eric Chappell's Rising Damp, especially in the gifted timing of Leonard Rossiter. He annealed their skills into his own brand of humour, which could be wicked. He punished distinguished Professor Brian Cox because Derek took exception to the fact that, unlike the rest of the company who attended the celebration of the life of Sir Patrick Moore aptly wearing a suit and tie, Professor Cox turned up in jeans and a blouson. Derek approached and told him that he thought he recognised him from somewhere, but he couldn't quite place him. "What do you do?" "Well, I work at CERN." "Oh, so you're not a proper astronomer." Being further pressed, the professor said that Derek might have seen him on television. Derek said, "I've got it. You've been in EastEnders." I asked Derek, how on earth did you take that? He said, "Well, we were on the front row, and most fortunately, at that moment, the Astronomer Royal came and sat between us." So thank you, Lord Rees, for saving the day. The entrepreneur establishing the brand new planetarium at Harewood called Derek's home number, wishing to recruit his expert advice on programmes for the development which was by then under construction. Derek's standard response on his 1950s black Bakelite telephone: "Yes." "Is that Mr. Derek Fry?" "Who is asking?" "Is that Mr. Fry, the teacher of astrology at the grammar school?" "It is most certainly not." I believe that in the end 4 calls were placed, by which time the caller had learned the error of his ways and was ready with the plea, "Please don't hang up." Fundamentally disappointed by any physics experiment which did not include a rubber band, he prepared his laboratory demonstrations with an ingenuity and precision that would delight the most reluctant pupil. And have you seen the picture of his final piece of board work? The GSAL Rolls-Royce fully labelled graph, ordinate, abscissa and all, and with the 1957 date appended in admission of and contrition for his most recent acknowledged plotting error. We loved that he had a wireless and not a radio, and on it listened not to Radio 4, but to the Home Service. And certainly not the live programme, most insubstantial. We loved his admirable detachment, his pretended lack of awareness even sometimes of the modish or ephemeral. The unabridged footage of his interview for the GSAL 10th anniversary celebration, a record to us beyond price, by the way, included his being provided with a cushion for parity of head height on the sofa with Matthew Lee. They have to do this for Tom Cruise, says the director apologetically. Derek's reply, who is Tom Cruise? His acts of intercession, as Paul has said, were huge, and not only for the rescue of his colleagues and pupils, but also for the school. Michelle would be the first to tell you that he not only gave us his subject, but also saved it gently and painstakingly from extinction, as Sue has acknowledged. His assertions had strength by their gentleness. When Brian Collins appointed him in 1987, there was newly in place a so-called buddy system, whereby newcomers would be mentored and cared for by an experienced colleague. Derek was allotted that rising star, Steve Field, to whom no one ever referred as Stephen, except his own mother, and then only in reprimand. So that in their buddy meetings, when Derek said, Stephen, Steve knew that in broad Huddersfield it meant, you need to listen to this lad. Derek, who eschewed any notion of management for himself, was in fact running the school by proxy. His fluent English provided a journey of development for all of us. His letters, his lessons, his occasional assemblies left us reaching for a dictionary to consolidate his new extension of our vocabulary. You didn't need odious or tedious any longer once Derek had put you in the way of rebarbative. He has fixed his place in the cosmos. He lives and will live in all of us, not only in our memory, but in our spirits and our best aspirations, and thus in the generations of those whom we teach according to his precepts. For his precepts were also his example, and they should be ours. With his family, resigned to his utter commitment to his academic and professional life, he shared both precious confidence and loving friendship. His cousin Barbara will represent him at the Queen's Garden party, to which he was, to his abject astonishment, just invited. I asked Edward, what should I say? He replied, what can you say? He was a fantastic man. Derek gets the last word. Fortunately for us, he drafted his own obituary. Well, he made a start anyway. And this is it. Derek Fry, brother of Malcolm and Christine, to be continued. I think he may have passed us the baton, and that this is not an inopportune time to reflect on that.
Thank you to all who have spoken so beautifully today. Thank you, Peter. We will now bow our heads and share a time of quiet in order to reflect on Derek's life in a way that is meaningful for each of us. We give thanks for the life of Derek, for all he has meant to us, for all our memories of him. We remember in deep affection our friend, our teacher, our colleague, Derek Fry. We look to support Derek's family and close friends at this time. We pray that Derek continues on his journey, is reunited in God's tender care with his parents, Stanley and Mary, his brother Malcolm, and his sister, Christine. In all our memories of Derek, inspire us with courage. Help us to understand that time and space are not the measure of all things. For love cannot die, and goodness and beauty are mightier than death. Amen. We will now join in Derek's second choice of hymn, "The Day Thou Gavest, Lord, is Ended." And once again, the first verse will be sung as a solo by Caris Winter, and following that, would you all join in? Please stand.
Thy day thou gavest,
I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, "Give me a light, that I might tread safely into the unknown." And he replied, "Go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than light and safer than a known way." Derek, go forth on your journey, and finding the hand of God, tread gladly into the night, and let God lead you towards the hills and the breaking of day in the lone east. And may God give us all his comfort and peace, his light and his joy in this world and the next. And the blessing of God be upon us and those we love and see no longer, now and always. Amen.